Hello, Garland Nixon here. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Jack Rasmus, and we're going to talk about economics and all kind of interesting things. Let's talk. Hello, all. You are in for a treat here with the brilliant Dr. Jack Rasmus. He has a PhD in political economy. He teaches economics at St. Mary's College in California. He's the author and producer of numerous books, including The Scourge of Neoliberalism, my favorite name, actually, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Bush, Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, Monetary Policy and the Coming Depression, and Obama's Economy, Recovery for the Few. Dr. Jack, welcome to my humble YouTube channel.
Oh, my pleasure. Just a correction. The latest book is U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump.
So, Reagan and Trump.
Reagan and Trump.
Okay, good. Reagan and Trump. My bad. I copied that. If somebody out there has screwed up your bio and the name of your book, but go to Amazon. Dr. Jack's got a lot of books there. He understands the whole neoliberalism stuff good, and he was a regular guest of ours on the now dearly departed Critical Hour. If I had a hat on, I'd have to take my hat off. Okay, Dr. Jack, let's go. When we talk about, something that I've discussed, and that is the so-called the outsourcing of labor, right? And the way I looked at it was this. I put it like this. Look, they didn't have any labor laws here. So guess what? They had child labor, no weekends, all these kinds of things. And as unions created an environment where they had to adhere to those kinds of labor laws and safety laws, outsourcing was simply, oh, well, let's go to some countries where we don't have to, where we can do that. People were like, they got sweatshops over there. They had sweatshops here. They just moved them to there. So if you can talk about your concept of labor exploitation in the area of neoliberal policy regime, are you talking about labor exploitation here? Anyway, get into it. Let's define what we're talking about and get going.
Yeah, well, just as a preview here, you can read my latest article, rather lengthy article that's going to appear here very shortly in the Union of Radical Political Economists newsletter on that very topic, labor exploitation. Okay, just a preview. But to get to your question, in the 1970s, labor had made some significant gains. People don't realize, but the largest strike in terms of total number of workers who went on strike occurred in the U.S., union workers I'm talking about here, occurred in the U.S. in 1971. Yeah, that was the biggest strike wave ever, and it was quite successful. Construction workers and manufacturing workers, auto, steel, and whatever, Teamsters, all of them, they averaged, now get this today, they averaged new contracts in 71, 25% wage and benefit increase in the first year of a three-year contract. That's what they averaged. Okay. It was so successful that the business people called in the government, the U.S. government, to stop it and roll it back, which they did. Richard Nixon, the president then, did a wage freeze in August of 71. And he then rolled it all back. The 25% became 5.5%. That was
but Dr. Jack, I thought they argued that the government shouldn't be involved in that stuff. Almost seems like that doesn't match.
Oh, well, the government has been involved in putting a lid on labor for ever since 1947 and the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which was really about a no strike act, in all kinds of ways. It used to be before 1947 that you could strike in sympathy, you could sit down, you could boycott the other companies. It was powerful. Labor had a powerful weapon, but they stopped that in its track with Taft-Hartley. And then, they cleaned up here and there after that with Lyndon Griffin and other acts and so forth. And then, of course, even so, they had to freeze wages and roll it back and create a wage board and so forth to hold down wages in the early 70s. And the heads of the wage boards, by the way, by 78, 79, I think it was, they said that, the whole idea of the wage board was the quote, to zap labor. And we did. They admitted it. So, the late 70s begins what I call industrial policy, new industrial policy, part of neoliberalism. You see, neoliberalism is a combination of four policies. One, industrial policy, hold down unions, hold down wages, make workers pay more for benefits, right? Privatize, industries and so forth, eliminate, labor legislation, etc. That's industrial policy. But there's three other policies that are part of neoliberalism. And one is monetary policy, the Federal Reserve. In other words, keep interest rates low, pretty much over the whole, because interest rates are low, businesses can issue bonds and raise free money and give it to their shareholders, right? So low interest rates, quantitative easing, whatever, throw the money at, at the banks and the big investors. Third, fiscal policy, increase war spending, hold down social program spending, and run deficits. And the fourth one is what's called external policy, and that is it relates to the dollar and running trade deficits and the U.S. dollar as the world hegemony currency, transactions and reserve currency. Those four policies were really introduced starting with the last years of Jimmy Carter, and then really introduced when Ronald Reagan, when he came into office. And those four policies had been developed further and further, exploiting labor. We can talk about how those policies exploited labor until 2008. And then it hit a wall, you see, with the crash in 2008. And they've been trying to patch up neoliberal policies ever since with not very much success. It's not gone yet, but they're struggling now. They, meaning the rulers, the elite of this country, right? Those four policies are what's called neoliberalism. You got to understand neoliberalism, and I'll finish on this, is really in foreign affairs, attack your foreign U.S. capitalist empire, attacking their foreign competitors. In the 80s, it was Japan, and to some extent, Europe. They tamed the hell out of them, and then they engineered the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's attack your foreign competitors, and also tame and corral your domestic challengers like labor, right? And social movements of the 70s and labor in the 70s I just described. So neoliberalism is really a class-based policy, and its foreign policy is what we used to call imperialism, right? But they call it neoliberalism. The academics created that term in order to cover up that it's really American imperialism. And in the 70s, America reestablished its global hegemony that was under challenge in the 70s with the crises of the 70s. It reestablished that hegemony ever since. And in fact, once the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, it expanded. And U.S. capital expanded around the world and deepened its control around the world. And that's been the history of the last 4 decades. Now, at the beginning, you mentioned offshoring, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was one way, just one way that they tamed the unions and held down wages. That's one way. And they offshored, it's estimated, 3 to 4 million good manufacturing and even some non-manufacturing jobs over the course of the 90s, especially, with NAFTA and the China PNTR and all the other bilateral free trade agreements and so forth, and massive tax cuts to U.S. businesses to move offshore. Yeah, the government actually passed tax cuts encouraging them to move offshore. Why do they move offshore? Well, it's cheaper to produce offshore, right? Plus, you get access to those markets offshore. So the tax system was really restructured under neoliberalism in one way to encourage offshoring and the loss of jobs. So people voted for the Democrats and the Republicans, and they voted to move their jobs offshore. And we know what happened to the deindustrialization of a lot of America in the, particularly around the Great Lakes area, occurred as a result. But that's one way that they tamed labor. And of course, when you have all this insecurity about your job being moved and so forth, unions and labor kind of pulled in, their claws, and they weren't as aggressive. And we began a 4-decade period of what's called concession bargaining. And the great gains of the previous decades were given up little by little, and all the bargaining that followed, by the manufacturing companies and the construction companies, the core of the union movement. Right? We've only just seen now in recent years the beginning of the end of concession bargaining. The Teamsters Agreement and the Auto Workers Agreement of last year or 2 years ago and last year, those are indications that the workers in the unions, after they changed their leadership, finally said no more concessions, right? And the fact that you had the COVID crash and everything, and the shortage of labor supply, which gave unions a new leverage that they never had before. And of course, we're seeing now the Boeing workers are, doing the same thing. We almost had the longshoremen in the East Coast do the same thing, but Biden stepped in and did what he did, getting them back into an agreement that he did with the railroad workers. Remember the railroad workers a couple of years ago? He broke that strike. The friend of labor, Biden and Pelosi and so forth, threatened the railroad workers. They were going to pass some anti-labor legislation even more onerous than existed. And they intimidated the workers, who only wanted 6 days of sick leave. That's all they wanted. That was the issue, right? But they broke that strike, right? The Democrats broke that strike. And of course, we got the Boeing situation going, which I predict that they would have broken that strike already if it wasn't for the election. They can't do it before the election. But the point is, offshoring weakened labor, and reversed, the great gains of the 70s or continued to reverse, because Richard Nixon started it all and Carter did it. Carter deregulated all kinds of industries and created competition, both the trucking industry and the airline industry and the communications industry. You see, there were numerous weapons and ways in which they tamed labor in the U.S. Offshoring was just one of them, right? Spreading the right to work laws to the states where you can't in a contract be required to join a union and pay union dues, right? That's the union shop, as they call it. It's a misnomer. And holding down the minimum wage. I think we went over a decade under Reagan, and then we went a decade again under Obama and the Democrats, holding down the minimum wage here. Until recently, some of the states bypassed the federal government. You still have the minimum wage of $7.25, right? And if you're working in the restaurant industry, your minimum wage is $2.35. Okay, I mean it's terrible. It's terrible what's going on with the minimum wage laws. By the way, on the minimum wage, Biden in 2020 ran on a part of the program saying that he was all for raising the minimum wage. But the first meeting when he got in office in January 2021, his first meeting was with, several dozen big corporate CEOs. And he promised them at that time that the minimum wage was off the table. He would not propose the minimum wage. So his very first meeting in office, Biden, was to squash the minimum wage. People don't realize that. You got to read it like on page 20 of the New York Times, what actually happened here. And of course, holding down the minimum wage and while prices rise is another way of exploiting labor, right? You exploit them through the price system. There are all other kinds of provisions too, like people don't realize the pensions. Part of neoliberalism was to destroy real pensions. Real pensions are what's called defined benefit plans, where you according to your contract, or if you're in the public sector, you put in so much money, and the employer puts in so much money per hour, right, into your pension plan. And when you retire, you are guaranteed so much per month, per year of service for pension. You're guaranteed that, you see. That's a real pension. And you still have some semblances of that in the public sector. But in the private sector, it's been destroyed and replaced with phony 401ks. What's a 401k? A 401k is, well, the company might put money in, it might not put money in to your private pension. But the important difference is with 401ks, the employer is not liable to guarantee you a pension. Under real pension plans, you were guaranteed a pension. The employer had to pay that pension. But what's happened is businesses have dumped their real pension plans onto the government agency called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. And when they do that, and have done that massively everywhere, you get about on average 55 cents of what you would have gotten per dollar under your real pension. The airlines dumped all their pensions. The steel companies dumped all their pensions. You only have real pensions left in the public sector, and maybe the Teamsters and a few other stronger unions, right? So that's a transfer of money. That's a transfer of money because, they make money off of the 401ks. That's another advantage of businesses. So, you look at pensions, you look at what's happened to healthcare, contract healthcare plans, right? Look what's happened internally. Well, the cost is being shifted onto the workers and their families, and the employers are paying relatively less, and the workers are paying more, and they're getting less coverage for it at the same time. I think like half, I saw something that half of the healthcare plans are $2,000 deductibles or more. I mean, what the hell good is a $2,000 deductible? Maybe if you're in a car crash or something, you get some coverage, but otherwise you don't get any coverage. This is all part of the shifting. You see, exploitation is about the 1% in the companies getting more of what's created, and the workers and consumers and households getting less. It's the shifting of the wealth that's being created every year, measured in GDP, right? It's shifted. The workers are getting less, relatively less, and the companies and the investors are getting relatively more. There was a good economist, His name is Emmanuel Saez at UC Berkeley. And I think Gerard Zachman has taken over his work. There's a database where he really looked at the government data that had never been looked at before, particularly Social Security data, right? That the government, Commerce Department purposely did not look at until he developed his work in the early 2000s, right? The government never reported how much income the 1% wealthiest households were getting. They never reported. They only reported fifths, like what's the top 20%? What's the next 20%, right? But Saez looked at the detailed data that showed what the 1% was getting, and even the 1/10 of 1% wealthiest households, and even the 1/100th wealthiest households. And what he found from 1998 on, and then he went back looking the other direction, what he found was that the wealthiest 1% households in the 21st century were getting 20% of all the income. 1%. I mean, you're looking at maybe several 100,000 households, Wow. I mean, there's how many households in the U.S.? 120 million. There's 120 million households in the U.S. There's 165 million people who are working or unemployed, right? So that a couple 100,000 is nothing, but they're getting 20% compared to what they were getting before. He went back in time and he looked at it, from the 30s and World War II. Starting in World War II, taxes were raised on the rich to help pay for the war. They were taxed 90% of their income in World War II. For the first time, of course, workers had to pay the income tax too. People don't realize this, but before 1942, most workers didn't pay any income tax. That started to finance World War II. Right? And also your payroll deduction of your taxes, your income tax, started with World War II. And the idea in passing at the time was that once the war was over, that was going to be ended. Well, of course, we know it didn't end, right? It continued. But the point is, if you look at what the share of income created, wealth created at 1% in the 1940s was 8 to 10%, compared to 20% now, right? And it stayed at 8 to 10% from World War II to the 1970s. It remained steady. And it wasn't until neoliberalism came that it began moving up and up and up. And as neoliberalism deepened, more and more money was kept by the 1%. And by the way, that doesn't count all the money they've been shoveling offshore, right? That's only what they can find onshore. So it's more than 20%. So neoliberalism, a class-based attack labor and movements at home, attack your competitors, the Japanese and whatever, abroad, now the Chinese and the Russians, right? Attack them abroad. It's imperialism, right? Is really about a class-based income and wealth transfer that's been very successful from the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, the outline was prepared by Carter as he tried to save his butt in an election that he knew he was going to lose. He just turned it all over to the big corporations, the CEOs. They made him change his his Fed chairman and introduce tax ideas. And Reagan just ran with those. Right, so, the Reagan policies, taxes and whatever, were really formulated, the outline, the blueprint, under Carter. He just ran with it and deepened it. And then, of course, you had Clinton deepening it even further. And then Bush came, and that was neoliberalism on steroids, right? And then Obama came after the crash. He tried to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and couldn't. We lost jobs from 2007, according to the 2008 and 9 crash. We lost millions of jobs, and we did not recover, in other words, get back to the level of 2007 jobs until 2015. Wow. It took almost 7 years to recover the jobs that we had lost. I mean, that was the story of my Obama Recovery for the Few book, right? At the same time, the banks were bailed out. The banks were bailed out in 1 year. By 2010, all the banks had been bailed out. Who bailed them out? Well, that's the role of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve threw $4 trillion into the banks in 2009-10. Bailed them out immediately. Also bailed out General Motors, spending $80 billion. And AIG, the insurance company, and a whole bunch of others. It bailed everything out. But the Fed did it, you see. Obama, he spent $787 billion on the rest of the bailout. Congress passed laws, $787 billion, right? The Fed gives $4 billion to the trillion. $4 trillion, excuse me, to the rich. And Congress throws $787 billion to the rest of us. $300 billion, of course, was also tax cuts, right? That's why we had a very weak recovery after 2008, only about 60% of normal after recessions. Very weak recovery. And of course, that gives rise to all the discontent in Trump, So by 2016, with jobs taking 6-7 years, right? And the recovery being very weak, except for the bankers and investors and finance capitalists, they make a lot of money as a result of the low interest rates, zero interest rates, QE, throwing money at investors. So, it was a weak recovery for everybody, except, the bankers and investors. And when you have that low interest rates, what happens? When low interest rates are that low, big corporations, they just issue bonds. They issue corporate bonds. They raise a lot of money. And because interest rates are maybe 1% for them, they don't have to pay very much for it. That's what the Fed does. The Fed not only throws money directly at them who wants it, but it drives interest rates down. That's why, neoliberalism likes low interest rates. This whole inflation thing where they had to raise interest rates, has been an aberration, and they don't like that.
Well, one of the things that I also recall, I was when I was studying Turkey, one of the issues they were having was this: that neoliberalism made these very low interest rates, so these corporations would then go out and get the easy money, and they would just spend it on. Normally, a corporation goes out and borrows $100 million. It has to be frugal. It has to make sure that this is a good investment. It has to look at what it's doing. They go out and get the $100 million and just spend it on a project. Because it was just so easy to get. There was one area where they had built all of these expensive condos or whatever in Istanbul, and they were just sitting there. Nobody could buy them. And basically, this easy money was an incentive for these corporations would get this easy money, but they would do a combination of things: reckless projects and money laundering. So they built. You got 100 million. You and I got to go run the corporation. We take 80 million. And we build, God, who cares? We take the other 20 million and we split it between each other in consultant fees and things of that nature. And we walk away. And who cares in the long run what happens to these projects or whatever, because we filled our pockets. And that's what they found with this easy money with the corporations. It caused them to be very, very reckless with their corporate projects.
Yeah, well, they speculate with the money, but you missed a big point,
Okay.
What did they do with that money that the Fed threw $4 trillion in 2008-9, and then the Fed in 2020 threw another $4 trillion at the banks, and they didn't even need bailout.
Right.
They needed it in 2008, but they didn't. But the Fed threw another $4 trillion anyway. COVID was an excuse to throw another $4 trillion at the bankers and big investors. Right? What did they do with that $8 trillion between 2008? Well, they did what.
Uh-oh, Dr. Jack is locked up. Well, everyone, what I'll do with Dr. Jack is maybe we'll move him out. Let's see. Oh, are you there? You back, Dr. Jack?
I'm back, right.
Okay,
right.
we lost you for a second. So you said, what did they do with that money? And then you locked up for a little while. Go ahead.
Yeah. What they did with the money was to give it to their shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividend payments. How much did they give since 2008? This will blow your mind. $16 trillion. The Fortune 500 companies alone have given to their shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividend payments $16 trillion. Under Biden, 1.3 to 1.5 trillion the last 3 years, every year of the last 3 years. And under Trump, the same thing, over $1 trillion. Under Biden, under Obama, it was like 800 billion, 900 billion. It's been rising. The corporations and the free money from the Fed is just a conduit to the shareholders. And what do the shareholders do with it and some of the companies do with it, right? Well, they invest it in stocks and bonds and derivatives and make even more money. You see the financial game that capitalism is playing in the 21st century, and that's why you got this runaway income and wealth inequality going on. The top 1%, their corporations and individuals, are making mountains of money through financial speculation and the Fed is feeding it. And of course, Congress is feeding it with the massive tax cuts as well. How much have we cut taxes since 2001? Well, I'll tell you. And of course, the tax cuts are then reinvested in financial asset markets too, right? How much? Well, under George Bush cut taxes $3.8 trillion over 10 years, starting in 2001. 3.8. Obama comes in office. He cuts them another $300 billion in 2009 as part of his $787 billion rescue plan, right? And then he extends the Bush tax cuts 2 years, costs another $800 billion. And then in 2013, he makes the Bush tax cuts permanent, and that costs $5 trillion more. So Obama cuts taxes $6 trillion to George Bush's $3.8 trillion. And then Trump comes in and cuts them $4.5 trillion more. Wow. It was $4.5 trillion. It was $4.5 trillion, not $1.5 trillion that you see in the media. And why is the media wrong? because the 1.5 trillion Trump tax cuts, really 4.5 trillion, 1.5 trillion is predicated on the assumption at the time in 2017 that US GDP would grow an average of 3.5% every year for the next decade. And that would bring in more revenue. Well, we know it didn't grow 3.5%. In fact, it crashed in 2021, and it's barely grown by 2% ever since. So that 1.5 trillion is not offset by more tax revenue because of growth. It's really 4.5 trillion. And the proof that it's Trump's taxes were 4.5 trillion is the Congressional Budget Office research arm that recently said that if we extend the Trump tax cuts another decade, it's going to cost the government another $5 trillion. So there's the proof that the Trump tax cuts are really $4 to $5 trillion, not 1.5. And then we got Biden coming on, and he cuts taxes for the rich another $2 trillion. That's in his three acts: the Infrastructure Act, the Chip and Modernization Act, which is a $52 billion slush fund for the semiconductor companies, right? And then the so-called misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. Tax cuts. We've cut taxes since 2001, $15 trillion. Now think about it, 15 trillion in tax cuts, 80% of which go to the rich and the corporations, right? And you got 17 trillion dollars in stock buybacks and dividend payouts just for the Fortune 500 companies, right? You see the relationship between
that's that $38 trillion deficit you're getting really close to, right there, thrown out the window.
There you go. You know, you cut taxes by 15 trillion, okay, at least. Then you throw away $8 trillion. You piss it away on wars in the Middle East since 2001. There's your $23 trillion, okay? Then you bail people out. Congress bails out, rescues $787 billion in 2008, and then another billion, and then another $3 trillion in programs in 2021. So there's 4 more trillion on top of your 23 trillion, that's 7 trillion. And then, of course, you got the price gouging going on by big pharma and insurance companies that are costing government, government health programs, an arm and a leg. I'm talking about Medicare, SHIP, Medicaid, and so forth. There's your 30 plus trillion dollars national debt. In 2000, the national debt was 5.6 trillion. Today it's 36 trillion. I just described to you 4 reasons why 30 trillion of that, we would have been still at $5-6 trillion that we were a quarter century ago. If it was 4 measures, tax measure, right? Monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, war spending, part of fiscal policy, shifting the costs onto government, not just workers of healthcare onto the government, which means your taxes, right? That's neoliberalism. That's fiscal and monetary policy of neoliberalism, which is continuing to shift the wealth and the income from 119 million households to the 1 million households. This is what 21st century is all about, of capitalism. It's all about on the domestic front. On the international front, it's the empire, U.S. global empire, under challenge here, and it's striking out. The wolf is cornered, and he's striking out violently with wars, chronic wars, sanctions and economic war and everything as it loses control step by step.
Well, let me ask you about this, because this is something that a lot of people who are watching, a lot of particular people who are on retirement programs, pensions, etc., with BRICS, with challenges to the dollar supremacy, and of course the bond market. I have heard various scenarios where people have said, look, those of you who are out there getting a retirement from whatever X corporation or even from the teachers union or this or that, be wary, because there are things afoot on the international economic scale involving the international economic infrastructure that at some point not can, but will affect the bond market, which will in effect either one of two things. Well, either it'll affect the bond market or collapse it or do something that'll hurt pensions, or the deflation of the dollar will happen so that we have hyperinflation. And then, as they say, you'll need a barrel of wheelbarrows to buy a barrel. I mean, excuse me, a wheelbarrow full of dollars. It'll take to buy another wheelbarrow to put your other, your dollars in. At any rate, your thoughts on those things: the bond market, pensions, the dollar deflation. Some guy's sitting there and he's getting his retirement right now and he's scratching his head saying, are things going to go bad for me?
Well, you've described the worst case scenario. That's not going to happen overnight, but where the momentum is in the direction over a period of time, what you described, the period unknown, really. But here's how, what you're really talking about is how the U.S. global economic empire, under challenge now by the BRICS and global South, right, is going to blow back on the domestic economy in the U.S.
Yes.
That's what you're describing, and I'll explain to you a scenario of how this most likely would happen. What you've got is the global South in the 21st century has advanced economically. It's industrialized. This is not the global South of the 80s. These are countries now that are far more self-sufficient and wealthy and able to assert their own independence of the empire. And that's what's going on. The global South, whether it's China, the BRICS, or other countries that are, asking to join the BRICS, right? They want more say. They've been knocking on the U.S. global empire door for a couple of decades now, and the U.S. won't let them in. The U.S. and its allies, the G8 allies of the U.S., G7 plus Australia, New Zealand, right, won't let them into the institutions, to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the WTO. Well, WTO is another question, and UN Security Council, and all these institutions of the West that the U.S. empire has been built upon since 1944. Right, these institutions. Right. By the way, let me digress briefly. I have a book coming out in March called The Twilight of American Imperialism by Clarity Press, which will explain a lot of these processes. Okay. But, the 21st century is really a breakdown of these institutions as the global South has industrialized, it's asserting itself. That's what the BRICS are all about. And that's been going on since the BRICS were formed in 2009, right? That's been very clear where the BRICS are trying to go. But the development of the BRICS has been accelerated by the U.S. weaponizing the dollar with its sanctions, particularly sanctions on Russia and China. The rest of the world is looking around and saying, well, the U.S., and this is part of its aggressive reaction, on the economic front, not just the wars on the political front, but the economic front. The sanctions are parallel economic warfare going on. The sanctions have said to the global South, we're not only not going to let you into the institutions, but we're going to slap you down if you don't respond to our demands. Our, meaning the U.S. empire's demands, right? The demand being you shouldn't buy Russian oil and Russian industrial commodities because we're in a proxy war in Ukraine against them, right? Well, the rest of the world is looking at this and saying, hey, we could be next. The U.S. is going to turn the screws on anybody. And a good example was how they turned them on Venezuela here, in previous decade, denying them access to dollars. Well, what's going to happen because of this is that the BRICS are moving, as they've said, to an alternative financial structure, architecture, as they call it, to the U.S. global financial architecture. The World Bank, the IMF, Bank of International Settlements, all of those key, SWIFT, the international payment system, messaging and signaling and payment system. There's a whole bunch of institutions, including one that's missed by most analysts that we can go into later, which I call the U.S. twin deficit system. But what's happening is, if you look at the recent Kazan meeting of the BRICS, where they've expanded their membership. And they have a declaration out, a statement, 108 or 10 clauses or whatever.
Right.
It's not just an alternative financial architecture, it's an alternative global economy within the economy. And the BRICS are saying to the West, to the US, let us in, let's play ball, and we'll integrate your empire with our independent, or else we're going to go by our own self here, and the hell with you, empire, right? That's what they're saying. If you read, because the BRICS statement, they're willing to cooperate, but the U.S. doesn't want to cooperate. They want to quash it, right? And they're doing everything they can behind the scenes to quash it. But this is how it works. This is how the blowback is going to happen. The scenario that you laid out initially in its worst case, right? If part of the empire was the agreement in 1974 with Saudi Arabia and OPEC that the trading in oil, crude oil, had to be in dollars. This was the 1974 agreement, right? Trading in dollars. At the same time, the U.S. passed the Smithsonian Agreement in 1973, which tamed Europe, right? And then in 1986, it introduced what it called the Plaza Hotel in New York, where negotiations were Plaza Accords, right, which put Japan in its place, right? But everything was traded, global trade since the 70s, especially oil, but also industrial commodities and a lot of other things, is traded in dollars. You had to, in the empire, buy dollars if you wanted to buy oil. And you had to buy dollars in your own currency if you wanted to buy medical supplies, and medicine. You had to buy dollars, and that's how the U.S. Controls everything. It's through the dollar. The dollar is the linchpin institution of these global empire institutions we mentioned. It's the linchpin, right? So what you got with the BRICS is we're not going to use dollars to trade. We're going to trade bilaterally with each other. And eventually here in the not too distant future, it's going to be digital. That's going to be the common currency, a digital currency, right, that they're moving towards here. It's not going to be the yuan or the Russian ruble or whatever. It's going to be a common digital currency using blockchain technology, right? And they're going to have their own, they've already announced it, settlements system and bank messaging system. Part of the U.S. global empire is its control of its what's called the SWIFT. That's an acronym, SWIFT, International Payments Messaging System. SWIFT is when you trade in dollars, you got to use SWIFT, which is based on U.S. banks, and the U.S. can see who's trading in dollars anywhere in the world. That's how they try to enforce sanctions. But if the BRICS move away from SWIFT and have their own payment system and their own currency, right? The U.S. can't see who's violating sanctions. They're blind now, right?
One of the things that I heard about that currency was, well, okay, for instance, okay, let's say the dollar is a currency that people are using. Anyone can get the dollar. You can use a dollar to buy a pack of bubble gum, or you can use it to buy, a pig iron for your steel mills, right? But my understanding was they were looking at a digital currency, but that digital currency wouldn't be something that anybody out here could use. It would only be used for the transfer of goods and services between these international members in the BRICS. That it wouldn't just be, let's throw a new currency out there and Garland and Dr. Jack can buy $10 worth of that currency and go buy a pizza with it. That it would be, this is an international trade currency only. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, well, they're going to try to do that, right?
Okay.
And the U.S. is going to move the digital currency, and so is Europe. They're going to try to keep it from transactions in the general populace, but that's going to be very difficult to sort of set up a border between private use and the government use. It's going to spill over because they don't want the general public to use digital currencies, because if they do, the central bank loses control of the money supply.
Right.
I mean, and that, if you
like
lose
Bitcoin, right? Yeah.
then you're back to the 19th century when there was no Federal Reserve and there were dozens of different kinds of dollars being used by different banks throughout the U.S. There was like a Bank of Philadelphia dollar and a Bank of the Savannah dollar. And that led to a lot of financial instability and depressions in the 19th century. The Fed, in 1913 said only we can create dollars, and it got a monopoly of the money supply as a result to bring some stability to the whole thing. But to get back to the scenario, if the rest of the world, the global South, is not using dollars, these countries are not going into global money markets, exchanging their currencies, whether Argentine pesos or whatever, for dollars in order to buy oil and energy and steel, aluminum and medical goods and so forth. Right? They aren't using it. What does that represent? That represents a decline in the demand for dollars.
Yes.
If dollar declines, the exchange rate, the value of dollar is just the price of money. And we know supply and demand drives much of the price of anything. So if demand declines for the dollar, the price of the dollar, the value of the dollar is going to go down. Now think of it this way. If the value of the dollar goes down, who wants to buy anything when its price is falling? No. If the price is deflating, if it's falling, you're going to say, well, if I buy it now, it's going to be worth less. So I'm going to wait until it stops falling. Right.
So the demand dies even more.
That's the fundamental of deflation, right? You would think, well, prices are down, people are going to jump in. No, investors wait until they see it falling. So you got all this money, dollars around the world that have accumulated, tens of trillions of dollars have accumulated under neoliberalism. Why have they accumulated in the world, in these money markets in the world? Well, because the U.S. neoliberal policy is to run a trade deficit purposely. The trade deficit this year is going to be $1 trillion alone. What's the trade deficit? The trade deficit is when you buy more goods from the rest of the world than they buy of your exports. Right. You buy more imports, exports. Well, that difference is negative, which means the money, the net is flowing out into the rest of the world. Well, that's been going on for 40 plus years. So there's a massive amount of money out there. U.S. imperialism, neoliberalism, has always functioned on the twin deficit institution. What is that? Well, I've described half of it. Trade deficit, money flows out. But the understanding ever since the 70s with the Saudis and everyone else was that, the rest of the world, you're accumulating our dollars, you're going to recycle them back to us.
Right.
You're going to buy treasury bonds or treasury notes, right? Or you're going to invest in the real economy. But all that money is going to flow back. And it has been flowing back. Japan and China used to over $1 trillion of just treasuries, and all the other countries in the world, Europe, right? The money has flowed back until now. Now there's a problem with giving all the money back. And then if you have the deflating of the dollar as a result of this conflict, who's going to want to buy dollars to invest in the U.S., which means to attract foreign investment into the treasuries, the Federal Reserve is going to have to raise interest rates. It's going to have to make it look even more lucrative to buy treasuries. Well, when you raise interest rates, you slow the domestic economy. And we have a shortfall of $1.8 trillion this year in the deficit. Accumulated deficits make up the national debt and the interest payments on the national debt, which this year are $950 billion. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, within 10 years, we're going to have to, the Fed, Federal Reserve, is going to be paying $1.7 trillion every year just on the interest of the debt. Well, that's more than the Pentagon's getting. That's more than Social Security, right? And who's getting it? It's the rich bondholders are getting transfer of income here. The point is, we've been financing our massive budget deficits with this flow back of recycled dollars. from the trade deficit. That's how they finance. The Fed sells all these bonds and so forth, uses that money to cover the budget deficit. And why do we have the budget deficit? Because we cut taxes 15 trillion and we spend $8 trillion on wars. Never in the U.S. history have we ever gone to war, and we've been at war for a quarter century now. Have we ever gone to war and cut taxes? But boy, we've done it big time for the last 25 years. I mean, the leaders of this country are busting their own domestic economy. But to sum up, the point is, if you have a declining demand for dollar, all things equal, in the long run, that dollar is going to weaken. It's going to slow down the recycling of the dollars back to the Treasury and the U.S. in order to finance the budget deficit, which means, you either raise taxes or stop your wars. If you can't get the money coming back, they're not going to raise taxes. These beautiful taxes they've paid all their rich investors, they're not going to stop those. We saw that. The Democrats wouldn't reverse Trump's taxes. The money bags of the Democratic Party, and now that's the main money bag party now, right?
One other thing that I got to throw at you. That being said, one of the things Trump said the other day that he's open to is what you said. Prior to the World War II, there were that workers didn't pay taxes. So Trump just recently says, I'm open to doing away with income taxes. In light of all of the other issues that you have brought up, is that feasible?
Totally no, because the income tax helps pay for the military and the empire and all the other subsidies to corporations. What he's talking about is a number of programs. The most important, I think, is that he announced that he wants to eliminate taxation on Social Security monthly payments, monthly benefit.
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, when that was started.
When?
Under Ronald Reagan. Before Ronald Reagan, we didn't pay taxes on our Social Security benefits. In other words, part of the neoliberalism.
Or on interest for loans and stuff. Back then, if you bought a car, you didn't pay interest on anything. You didn't pay interest on any loans. You didn't pay taxes on that, or that was all tax deductible.
It was all tax deductible, right? It was all tax deductible in the 70s, right? Long list of all your interest payments you could deduct from their taxes. Plus, your credit card interest was topped at 7%.
Yeah, that's right.
They couldn't raise. They couldn't make you. The banks that own Visa, MasterCard, they couldn't charge you more than 7% interest. Of course, that was changed under Reagan too. Now, what is it, 23%?
Oh, yeah. Well, depending on some circumstances, it's up in the 30s. You know what I mean? They can play with the numbers to get it up higher.
It's 23%. In 2019, it was 16% interest on credit cards. Under Biden, it's 23%, right? And the same thing with all interest charges. They've all gone up significantly. You know how much your mortgage payment has risen since 2019?
No.
114%. Mortgage, and that's what you pay out of your disposable income. You don't pay the price of a house, which has gone up 47% since 2019. Mortgage payments have gone up, which is the price of your house, the principal and the interest and the fees, 114%. Yeah. And rents that follow they follow housing prices, right?
And of course, vehicles, people can't afford to. People can't afford to buy new vehicles.
No, and you can't afford to repair your old one either. Just in the past year, auto repair prices have gone up 20% in 1 year, right? Auto insurance is 20%. Okay, gasoline prices since 2019 up 38%. The most often purchased grocery prices, according to Wall Street Journal survey, up 35%. You see, this is what people are remembering when they go to vote next week.
Yeah.
The level of prices since 2019 have gone through the roof. Oh, the Democrats say, food is only up 1% the past year, which is BS, right? But they say, the rate of increase is only 2.5% the past year. Well, people aren't paying 2.5%. They're paying 35%. And they're remembering that when they go to vote next next year. That's why Trump and Vance are talking about take-home pay, right?
Right,
They're
right.
they're not talking about your unadjusted wages, unadjusted for inflation, hourly wage, right? Which is only, by the way, for full-time workers. There's 50 million part-time temp gig workers in the economy. They aren't in those government figures, right? I got an article I'm working on called 17 Reasons Why the Inflation Index is Lowball Prices, right? We won't get into the details of that. But the point is, inflation level is the number one issue in the economy. All the polls show it. Number one issue, you know.
I'll say this, Dr. Jack, in talking to people, there's a lot of talk about, people in the Black community who are voting for Trump or not supporting the Democrats. Amongst the people who are generally, working class, working poor people, amongst those people, I wouldn't say the number one thing I hear. The only thing I hear is the cost of fill in the blank. Oh, it's too expensive to live. It is their day to day. And people will say, somebody will say negative things about Trump. They'll say, I don't care. You know what I mean? You have voters that say, I don't really care about all of the rest of that stuff. If you can bring the price of gas back to $2 or, the price of chicken wings down 35%, whatever the hell it is, you know what I mean? Eggs, things like people look at this. One of the things you'll hear them talk about is the price of eggs. Because it's something that they can see.
Up 113% since 2019. 113%. These are government figures, by the way. The 35% for groceries, 38% for gasoline, and so forth. These are government figures. I'm not making these up. Even their lowball price indexes say it's this much, right? Yeah, I mean, that's the number one issue. But, if you listen to the rallies and the debates and the discussions, what is Harris saying about how she's going to reduce these inflation? Nothing.
She says she's going to do it.
How am I going to roll it back? Nothing. And, neither is Trump saying, how am I going to roll it back? He's pointing out to the realities, at least, right? But neither of them are saying how they're going to roll it back.
Let me ask you this. We'll take a couple more minutes because I do want to ask you about this. So, I remember watching one of these town halls with Harris, and one of the guys, everything you see, somebody in there stands up and says, basically, there's pain at the grocery store. What are you going to do? Now, Harris says, price gouging, but then eventually she admits, well, that's only during a national emergency or something that these laws, and people are saying, what would you do to address my day-to-day pain at the grocery store, right? When I walk down an aisle in a grocery store, there's not one aisle that say prices for white people, prices for women, prices for, Native American. No, they're prices for the LGBTQ. No, everybody who walks into that grocery store is feeling the pain. What are you going to do? Here's my question for you, Dr. Jack. Is there anything that any of them could do to address those prices in the grocery store? And if so, what?
Yeah, well, grocery prices are kind of difficult to roll back, because there's so many of them. Which ones do you choose, right? Put a price control on, right? A limit on how much you could raise prices. Government could do that, of certain essentials. They did that successfully during World War II, right? So it can be done, but business, of course, does not want that. But you could roll back prices in other areas. There's our ways of doing it in terms of shelter and housing. There are certainly ways of doing it when you talk about drug prices and you talk about healthcare prices, medical insurance, and all that stuff. Insurances in general, that could be done in a number of ways.
Energy prices, because energy prices, of course, that's one of the drivers in all of the inflation.
Yeah, you could put price controls on energy prices, certain elements of energy prices. You see, the problem with energy prices is that you got massive price gouging. That's the core of the corporate price gouging. How do the energy companies gouge prices? They control the refinery process. We haven't built any refineries in this country for decades, purposely, because when they want to raise prices, there's a fire in a refinery in South Texas, or we got to do maintenance, and they always do it in the spring before everyone starts driving. You see, And they use that as an excuse. Or when you have something going on, offshore abroad, they're going to attack Iran or something. They use that domestically as an excuse, even though they got a massive oversupply of crude oil in this country. There's a massive oversupply. There's an oversupply of natural gas. Okay. And if you were just looking at supply and demand and not monopolistically controlling the supply and, leaking it out little by little, dribbling it out to people, prices would be much lower. But in no way is either candidate going to attack the big oil companies. No way, And, in terms of rolling back prices, what does the only thing I can find that Harris said is, we're going to control the price of 10 select drugs, prescription drugs, but not until 2026. Right.
Right. And the other 150,000 that the Medicare buys, well, you're on your own. Well, and not only that, if I own this company, if I'm selling drug X, and I know in 2026 I got to negotiate the price. All I got to do is increase the price about 300 or 400% between now and 2026. Yeah. Increase the price 300%, negotiate it back 150%, and I still got 150%. That's easy. Exactly. You're like giving me the keys to the city.
I can give you a personal example. I've had experience with this. I've been prescribed my doctor for a new drug a couple months ago, right? And one pill, they wanted to charge, 90 pills, 3 months, $750 for 3 months, out of pocket, because it's not covered by the drug plans because it's a new drug, $750. The same company in Canada, I ordered the same drug for $200. So the U.S. drug companies are gouging you $500, and this is repeated in scores and scores of drugs, right? They're charging me $500 more than they're charging the Canadians for the same thing. And that's going on everywhere. The drug companies, big pharma is gouging the hell out of everybody, just like the oil companies, just like other companies and industries that they have a monopolistic control. They can manipulate the price, and they're doing it. And the government is not doing anything about it. They're letting these companies go away, unless it's a token little thing like, we're going to stop 10 drugs, back, 2 years from now. And that's the only thing you get from Harris, right?
Well, we know she was born in a middle-class family. We know things of that nature. What's funny? And a lot of people say that. I've heard people say this. She talks about how much she struggled. It was rough and blah, blah, blah. But when you talk to people on the street who, came up with parents who didn't have a lot of education, barely made, first one in their family to go to college, that kind of stuff. And they say, well, both of her parents had PhDs. That doesn't sound like she was in poverty. I'm not saying she was rich. I'm just saying for the person who grew up, in a poor neighborhood, in a poor community, to tell them that both of your parents had PhDs and neither one of their parents had a high school education. Your dad was working on the county roads and mom didn't work, or what, to be people who barely made it, to pretend to, have some kind of an economic alignment with them. It's preposterous. But anyway, Dr. Jack, everyone, Dr. Jack Rasmus, let me let you know who he is again. He has a PhD in political economy. He teaches economics at St. Mary's College in California. He's the author and producer of numerous books, including The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump, Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, Monetary Policy and the Coming Depression, Obama's Economy, Recovery for the Few, and many, many more. You can go to Amazon.com and look up Dr. Jack Rasmus. And his books. Also go to Jack Rasmus, that's RASMUS, jackrasmus.com for all of his latest work. Hopefully, Dr. Jack, you'll be able to come on regularly, weekly. I'd love to have you on, or, whenever something major comes out, maybe sometimes more than weekly if you're interested.
Yeah, join me on my Friday radio show.
Okay.
Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network, 2 p.m. Eastern time, where I talk about topics of the week of interest, political and economic. And join me on X at Dr. Jack Rasmus here, where I comment daily a few times on events of the the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
So you can reach me on all those, and stay tuned for my next book, as I said, in March, Twilight of American Imperialism.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and hopefully it isn't the twilight of humanity. It's how does an empire, the first collapse of an empire, because I could argue the Soviet Union didn't collapse on its own weight. You know what I mean? There was some level of, what's the term they use when they blow a building up, a controlled demolition, right? But it maintained a lot of, if you deal with the Russians, we talk to the Russians now, a lot of the culture of the Soviet Union, they're very bureaucratic. A lot of things remain. So it wasn't an uncontrolled crash. It seems to me that this one here may be an uncontrolled crash. Anyway, Dr. Jack, we got plenty to talk about. Next week, we're going to have to talk about the election. I think that's going to be interesting. Maybe we'll get to it like the day before or something. But jackrasmus.com, that's where you want to go. Dr. Jack Rasmus on X. Make sure you follow him there. Thanks a lot, Dr. Jack. Everybody, don't forget, it's very important that you share this on all your social media platforms, wherever you can. You see everything scrolling across the bottom. If you can afford, buy me a coffee, Patreon, Cash App, whatever. If you can help the channel, that certainly would be appreciated. Thanks a lot, Dr. Jack. Everyone, we're out.
Let's talk.